Taliban leaders are promising this time things will be different in Afghanistan. They say women's rights will be protected and Americans and their allies will not be killed. But the vague promises aren't convincing many inside or outside the country, and it's certainly not changing any plans for the U.S. military.
Time is of the essence. We have the capacity to literally move thousands per day. Any attack on our people or on our operations at the airport will be met with a swift and forceful, unambiguous response.
There are, of course, the tens of thousands of vulnerable Afghans fearing for their lives under Taliban rule, some eligible for U.S. visas, far more not. Many of the former are worried they won't be able to get to the airport to board American planes, and many of the latter have little hope at all of escaping, including Afghanistan's youngest female mayor, who told the UK's iNews, quote, "I'm sitting here waiting for them to come. There is no one to help me or my family. I'm just sitting with them and my husband, and they will come for people like me and kill me." Back in the U.S., Joe Biden is taking the brunt of the blame for all that's unfolded in recent days, especially given a new report from the New York Times about the grim intel assessments that were coming out of Afghanistan as the president was assuring the public the Afghan government would not likely fall. But as Biden told the world yesterday, he still believes this was the right call.
The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. I cannot and will not ask our troops to fight on endlessly in another country's civil war.
I'm joined now by retired Army Colonel and BU Professor Emeritus Andrew Bacevich. He's now the president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Andrew, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Happy to be with you.
You wrote in a Globe op-ed yesterday in part, but the issue demanding concerted attention is not how we left, but why we went there in the first place, what we did, and why we stayed so long. Barbara Lee was the only member of Congress to vote against the original invasion. I assume you're not saying in that sentence we shouldn't have dealt with bin Laden and those who harbored him, the Taliban, but rather this fool's errand of staying to nation build was where we should have drawn the line. Am I right about that?
That's correct. And I had occasion recently to go back and examine the statements issued by the United States and its allies after the Bonn conference, Bonn, Germany, at the end of 2001, laid out our objectives, and they are extraordinary. You know, national reconciliation, spreading liberal values, protecting human rights, all, of course, incredibly admirable, but not realistic then. And I think we spent the last 20 years coming to realize that those goals were not realistic. So the big mistake was made right at the outset of this very long war.
You know, one of the things I take away from the dozens of discussions I've been fortunate enough to have with you through the years, Andrew, is that most of us don't learn, our leaders as well, don't learn from our mistakes. Secretary of State Blinken went out of his way repeatedly on the Sunday talk shows to say there was no similarity between what we saw with the fall of Saigon in '75 and what we've seen the last few days in Kabul. I see a great similarity. You do as well, do you not?
Of course. I mean, different kinds of helicopters. You know, then it was Hueys, now it's Blackhawks and Chinooks. But the collapse was as abrupt. The collapse was as unanticipated by senior U.S. officials, certainly U.S. intelligence agencies. You know, I as I've been watching these events unfold, I remind myself that I don't have a personal stake in this war in the same sense that I did in the Vietnam War, the Iraq War. But I got to tell you, I have felt such a sense of shame and humiliation and embarrassment and disappointment that this disaster should have befallen our country yet again. And of course, that the Afghan people now are going to be left to pay the consequences. It's just, the whole thing is just so disheartening that I have a hard time expressing myself.
I think you expressed yourself quite clearly and quite well, but maybe a naive question. We apparently learned nothing from the Vietnam experience. Why don't we learn from the history of failure?
big question, essential question. People write books about these things. I tend to think that the ultimate answer goes back to use a phrase that's been in circulation lately, the concept of American exceptionalism. That we are hardwired to believe, we the American people, that we are called upon to save the world, to save humanity, to spread our values, to bring history to its intended destination. We are fed that line by politicians. We are fed that line by pundits. And it's deeply embedded in our sense of who we are. And what's so discouraging is that even after a Vietnam, I think even after an Afghanistan, the amount of serious self-reflection tends to be minimal, inconsequential. And we snap back to the attitudes that we had before the disaster befell us.
I'm one of those people who believe leaders will do what we, the people, force them to do. But when you read things like the Afghanistan papers, Washington Post, Craig Whitlock, and see that there has been bipartisan lying to the American people almost relentlessly about how well things were going, what our hopes for the future of our effort in Afghanistan were to be, how do the American people make an informed enough decision to be able to move their leaders when those same leaders choose to lie to us about our prospects?
Well, it's very hard. I think perhaps the place to begin is to realize that these leaders dissemble, that their priority is to preserve their prerogatives so that they can be in charge, so that they can make the decisions, to use that phrase that's been used lately, so they can to be in the room, and that leads them then to lie to us, to keep us in the dark, because were we to fully understand, were we to understand that the war in Afghanistan has been going off the tracks for the last 15 years or so, then we would refuse to indulge them in their efforts to exercise power. I think from the inside, that's viewed as intolerable.
I want to discuss current events for one more minute, then try to step back and get a larger view, Andrew, if I can. Joe Biden yesterday said the buck stops with me, and then it didn't. When I heard him yesterday talking about how many people didn't want us to withdraw from Afghanistan, my response to that was the same as I had to George W. Bush when he used to say all the time, for those who say we should cut and run from Iraq. I didn't know anybody was saying we should cut and run, nor do I know many people who thought we should not withdraw from Afghanistan, but rather it was the exit strategy. And even though I know you don't want to obsess on that because you believe the larger issue was a succession of presidents and a succession of decisions through so many years, how could a guy with so much foreign policy experience be so wrong on something so important?
Well, it would appear that he was fed wildly misleading intelligence reports. Now, you might say, and I think it'd be a good point, well, how can somebody as experienced as Biden and basically as savvy as Biden, how could he not have challenged those reports? How could he not have seen through them? And I don't know. I mean, I think we really get into trying to understand the inner workings of an administration. Who gets to talk to the president, and how frequently. I mean, it's a small point, but I was struck by over the weekend, things are falling apart, and Biden's up there at Camp David. Having video conferences. I mean, I must say, had I been in his shoes, I would have instructed my chief subordinates to get to Camp David now and be prepared to sit up all night long to enable us to get a better grip on the situation. So at least the visuals of that communicated a kind of a casualness that didn't fit with the urgency of the situation, at least as I observed it.
So hearkening back to what we talked about a minute ago about our leaders not learning from history, what should they learn from the history of 20 years in America's longest war?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest lesson is to come to an appreciation of the limited utility of force. You and I are approximately the same age, part of the same generation. I don't think I sentimentalize the past, the 1950s and so on. But I do think it's the case that when you and I were growing up, the principal purpose of American military power was to avert war, to avert the big war, to avert World War III. Now, there was stuff going on the periphery, in Korea, in Vietnam, with the shenanigans of the CIA. But the major purpose of the United States military was to prevent a war, contain communism, defend Europe and our allies. Something flipped after the end of the Cold War. And the American establishment came to believe that military power was useful, could be put to work. We could use it to solve problems. And that began, particularly in the 1990s, but certainly going after 9/11, this spate of military activism where we intervened in countries with an expectation of being able to put things right. Some of the episodes were small and were brief. Somalia, which ended in a disaster. Some of them were much larger and more protracted, with Iraq and Afghanistan being examples. But our track record, our ability to fix things by the use of military power is mixed at best. And for some reason, that's the lesson I think that has not yet sunk in Washington. We face challenges. Setting aside Afghanistan, face challenges, geopolitical challenges. China as an example, larger challenges, the climate chaos. But by God, we should come to the realization that deploying American soldiers or dropping bombs may, on occasion, be necessary, but it should not be the primary instrument that we turn to when we're trying to deal with the threats to our nation.
Andrew Bacevich, I always appreciate your insight. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.